Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb. Becky Scher is off today. We are bringing you another bonus episode this week based on the developing story about the criminal charge against DFL State Senator Nicole Mitchell. Today I'm joined by former Speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives Kurt Daudt and former Crystal City Council member Jeff Kolb, who is a frequent co-host and guest on this podcast. We're going to discuss the ongoing and developing legal issues surrounding Senator Mitchell, the implications it could have on the current legislative session, and how it could potentially remake the political landscape in Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining us for this special bonus episode, and we hope you enjoy the show. I'm excited to be here today to host a special bonus episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. In order of previous appearances, we have the Honorable Jeff Kolb, who previously served on the Crystal City Council and has been here on the podcast multiple times as a guest and also co-hosting when I've been unavailable. We also have a very important guest, first-time appearance, former Speaker of the House, Kurt Daudt. Mr. Speaker, it's great to have you. Jeff, it's always great to see you too.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me on. It's my honor to be on with you guys. So thanks for inviting me.
For our listeners, Representative Daudt served in the Minnesota legislature, first elected in 2010. He stepped away from the legislature just before the start of this session that we're in now, and he currently works as a consultant. He's the former Speaker of the House. He served as Speaker from 2015 to 2019. A wealth of institutional experience, a wealth of political experience. I've known him for a very long time, and I think it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, that this circumstance that developed that we're going to discuss here today about a state senator, you've offered us an interesting amount of commentary and analysis on your Twitter page, which Jeff and I discussed, we thought would make you the absolute perfect guest to discuss this.
I don't have staff anymore to tell me to put we used to have a blue pair of mittens in the caucus and we called them Twittens. And if somebody in the caucus got out of control on Twitter, we would make them wear these mittens so they couldn't tweet. Unfortunately, there was no one there to tell me to stop tweeting.
How often were they just kept in Representative Garofalo's office, or how did that?
He should get his own.
That is exactly why we had them. No,
that's great.
Yeah.
Representative Garofalo has been on the show multiple times, and we hope to have him back. That was meant in jest and just friendly banter, Representative. Let's discuss why we're here today. News broke within the last 40 hours that a Minnesota state senator from Woodbury, Nicole Mitchell, was charged and booked into the Becker County Jail on suspicion of first-degree burglary. She's a state senator from Woodbury, but she was arrested all the way in Becker County in Detroit Lakes. Jeff, why don't you describe some of the background of the case?
Sure. Before we get too far into it, I want to do just a little bit of housekeeping for the audience. This is a podcast. We are recording at about noon on Wednesday. This story, the senator was arrested on Monday morning at about 4:45 in the morning. So it's a fast moving story. It's possible more news on this will break as we're speaking, but we're going to do the best to get you the most up-to-date information that we have available. The story is developing as we speak with new statements coming out, but the long and short of it is the senator was arrested in her stepmother's home. According to the charging documents, she was charged with first-degree burglary. According to the charging documents, she was in the home dressed in all black with a black hat. She had a flashlight with a sock over it, and she entered through the window, I believe she left her backpack in the window, if I understand that part of it correctly. The backpack was stuck in the window. Maybe she was trying to go out the window.
The backpack was holding the window ajar.
Yeah, something like that. And then when the police came, she made a few comments to the police. Before she was Mirandized, she made the comment, "Obviously, I'm not very good at this." And then it looks like she got into a little verbal altercation with the stepmother while the police were there and told the stepmother that, "I'm only here to try and get back some things that belong to me or some things that you won't give me because you've stopped talking to me." That was mentioned in the charging documents. And then also After she was Mirandized, she told the police, "I know I did something bad," which paints a pretty clear picture of what happened that night. She also admitted to leaving her home at 1 a.m. and then driving the 3.5 hours or 2.5 hours to Detroit Lakes. And then, so she made a number of admissions and talked about why she had been motivated to do this related to her father's ashes. There was also a laptop found in her backpack that when the police opened the laptop, it opened to a login page with her stepmother's name on it. Her explanation for that was that her stepmother gave her a laptop a long time ago. She was arrested. She spent the night in jail, and she was arraigned Tuesday during the day, around 11 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, and then came back to the Twin Cities and then released I don't even know how to characterize. What word would you use to characterize the statement that she released when she got back? I can't. There's a lot of
Creative.
creative.
Creative, yes.
That's a good one. She has come up with her side of the story, which is she was very worried about her stepmother, who has Alzheimer's, and she was going to check on her health, and it was all just a big misunderstanding. So I think that's a recap of. Can start there, and we can go from there.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask you if I can. You have been, aside from being Speaker, when you're the Speaker position, you were also Majority Leader, correct?
I was
Minority Leader, correct. Minority Leader.
I was Speaker for 4 years, and then I was Minority Leader for another 4 years. So I was Leader of the caucus for 10 years total.
Yep.
Which really is one of the longest serving in recent history. I guess Svigum is the only one that's served longer than that as leader. Hortman will probably pass that shortly if she gets reelected.
The reason why I ask is because in both of those roles, in one, you're the leader of, in essence, the entire legislative body,
Yep.
and in another, you are the leader of your caucus, the Republicans. And so in both of those capacities, you have had a leadership role over sometimes all of the members or just members of your caucus. Describe the dynamics that you think are going on when a member in the House or Senate gets in trouble. What type of things are going on, particularly inside the caucus and from a leadership perspective?
Sure. I will start with these calls are the worst. When you are the leader of the caucus, you are the parent of all of these members. And if it's someone in you, I should preface that to say they're the worst when you get them and it's one of your members. I always liked getting these when it was the other side because it gave you an opportunity to point out the inconsistencies in how they would handle this situation. But they really are the worst. And when you're the caucus leader, you become the parent for all these members. We had, I think the most I had was 77 and the least I had was like 60. I can't even remember now, maybe 62 or maybe 60. But those folks are people. They make mistakes. They have lapses of judgment, and sometimes they go through tough times in their life. They maybe drink too much or have a substance abuse problem or make a bad financial decision or just do or say something really stupid. And it's immediately in the world that we live in, when somebody in the political sphere says or does something like this, it becomes a big story immediately. And how you respond to it is important. How you apologize for it, how you work through it determines your ability to be effective in the legislature going forward, if at all. Some of these, I think, have a potential to disqualify someone from running for office. But the caucus also is a family. And so sometimes you feel sympathetic and you want to be supportive. You also are angry. And I can't believe you did this, right? In the same way that a parent does with their own child. It's challenging. But then you also need to figure out, as the caucus leader, you have to figure out what's the best strategy here what sort of message can we put out to either explain this or apologize for it or whatever. When I was Speaker of the House, I had to decide on, is there some sort of punishment? I actually removed members of my own caucus from committee chairmanships, I think twice. I don't know that the other side has really done that, have removed our members from committees and been punitive that way. But I don't know that they've really punished their own members in the same way. But I always tried to be very consistent. And then you also have to get the team together and talk about it, talk it through, make sure people understand, make sure that you don't have anybody out talking about things in an inappropriate way. And one of the things I noticed last night was elected Democrats are pretty much silent on this. I didn't see anybody on Twitter. I didn't see anybody engaging in the town square, the virtual town square of social media. So you got to make sure you keep that under wraps and then try to come up with a path forward. And I think that the circumstances of each situation dictate the ability whether you can do that or not. And I had members that had to resign, and we had to fill those seats with special elections. And I had members that I thought were going to have to resign who actually came through their controversy with no issues whatsoever. So I think how you handle these situations in the moment and how honest you are with the public really can help determine whether you're going to have a problem or not.
As we speak right now, the DFL, the Senate DFL is in a caucus meeting. Obviously, none of us are in the room, but based on your experience and what that meeting is like, what do you think is happening in the room? Do people go through the whole grief cycle all at once, and you have some people mad and some people sad and some people is there yelling? Or what does the dynamics of that room look like at the moment?
It really can be all of the above. And maybe before I talk about that, we should talk about like the importance of the dynamics of politics in the state of Minnesota right now. We have a Senate that has a 1-seat majority. She is in the majority party. If she, for some reason, cannot vote or has to resign, it means that we have a tied Senate, and we have, 4 weeks left of the legislative session, or a little bit less than that, maybe 3.5 weeks, 3 weeks. So the stakes are very high, right? And the majority party, the Democrats in the Senate, also have a majority in the House, and they have a Democrat governor. So they have a trifecta and can do anything that they want. This is the last 3 weeks or 3.5 weeks of a biennium where they've had complete control. And sometimes you leave things till the end thinking there's not going to be a problem. We should be able to pass whatever we want. And some of these things will still work out the details internally, and we'll pass them at the end. This puts in jeopardy anything that they were thinking about passing between now and the end of session, so the stakes are very high. Back to your question about what's going on in a caucus meeting, if you look at it through the lens of how high the stakes are in this situation, you can have. I would assume that there is a lot of, hey, we really are sympathetic about the fact that this was a family situation and that you lost your father and you're grieving and maybe struggling with how to deal with a stepmom that sounds like you don't get along with, and trying to retrieve some of your dad's things that are so sentimental to you. I think everybody can be sympathetic with that sort of situation. And then the flip side of that is you did something incredibly stupid. And in my years in the legislature, I always think that there's nothing that I've seen it all. There's nothing that can shock me anymore. This one was shocking. And the gross lapse of judgment to enter someone's home in such it's almost comical how bad the planning or thought process must have been to lead her.
She did have her Senate ID on her at the time when she was arrested, right? So I mean that does it. So you have, on one hand, it was very thought out and very well planned, definitely premeditated. But on the other hand, I think it was an understatement when she told the cops, "I'm obviously not very good at this." See, she's not in the room today. She's not at the Capitol today. So Senator Mitchell she is not at the Capitol. So I think the interesting dynamic of that is that then your peers are sitting in a room talking about you and you're not there, unless of course she could dial in or potentially, but there's certainly an emotional difference between having someone on a Zoom screen and then having somebody standing in front of you and what they're going to do. I think what's interesting is, as this story unfolded, it became clear pretty early that this was some kind of family dispute when the information came out about where she was and where the police report was. And I think some people overplayed their hand immediately or went a little bit too harsh and didn't wait for enough facts to unfold. I think what really gassed the situation, or what will continue to gas the situation, is the statement that she put out, which asks everybody to just suspend reality entirely. And she puts out a completely different set of facts than what's in the charging documents. Basically, her attorney came out just a few minutes ago and said she had a key to the house. Well, she told the police that she had entered through the window. So if she had a key to the house, why did she go through the window? I also have to say, she has probably one of the worst attorneys that I've seen try to handle this case in public.
No,
the attorney So the attorney actually went out and essentially admitted to the elements of the crime and said in a statement to the Star Tribune, yeah, she was trying to get in and out without being noticed, and then also she was just trying to get some stuff back that she thought belonged to her, but there's a dispute about whether it really belonged to her. And to have your attorney go out and basically say, well, sure, she broke into the house and took stuff that doesn't belong to her, but we should really all calm down about this, was just amazing to watch. I just couldn't believe, to your point about not being able to be shocked, this one has taken like every strange turn. I was really strange.
I think, too, there's a dynamic at play here where automatically the people in her caucus she's part of that caucus family, and they will rally behind her and want to support her as anyone would as a family member. And we've all had family members who have gone through tough times, and you lift them up and you rally behind them. But there's a juxtaposition with the law. And our hearts may go out and say, we understand that you wanted to retrieve a couple of your father's things that might have been very sentimental to you. And I'll just say what was in the charging documents, because I think her statement contradicting that and coming up with a whole new, ignoring the facts as we understood them in the case, is a whole separate dynamic. But let's just, for the moment, talk through. She says she wants to go and get some of his ashes and a flannel shirt. And so I think your heart can go out for that sort of a situation. But when you understand that she is a lawmaker, someone who votes on and creates the laws that we all have to abide by in the state, and the law is pretty specific in this case. And this case was charged as a first-degree burglary, which is a felony charge. And under first-degree burglary, there's three things, and you really only have to meet one of them. And one of them is the person who lives in that residence, who is not an accomplice to the crime, must be home at the time. So if you're breaking into a home that's occupied and that person is not part of an accomplice to the crime, they're a victim of the crime, that qualifies you as a first-degree burglary. And that's the one in this case that she met the requirement of. And then was there an assault or was there a weapon used? So if you broke into a house and you had a gun or whatever, even if there was nobody home, it would still qualify as a first-degree burglary, or if there was an assault. Those two, apparently, she didn't meet that, but she did meet the stepmother was home at the time. Interestingly enough, she basically confessed to this crime to the police when she was arrested. And the way I read the statute, you don't have to have even stolen anything. You just have to break into the home, either with the intent to steal something, which she admitted to, or have stolen something, which she did get caught with some property that apparently was not hers. But interestingly enough, if the person is home when you break in, there's a victim in the house when you break in who is not an accomplice, there is an automatic mandatory 6-month mandatory minimum sentence. So she has to serve and she basically confessed to this, and all the evidence suggests that.
After she was Mirandized, which is important, right? Because you sometimes get into those, is it admissible, is it not admissible? But this is clearly, and she also, I don't know if she was a licensed attorney or if she just has a law degree, but she has used the term attorney or has mentioned that in the past. So you're not dealing with somebody who's unsophisticated in matters of the law, which I think is going to be a problem for her as well.
So when you get into the dynamic of what's going on in the caucus, they want to rally behind their family member and lift her up and support her. But they also have to remember that they are a majority party in a legislative body in the state of Minnesota that has complete control of state government, and they are responsible for making the laws. So can they so flagrantly disregard one of their own members who has basically now confessed to a felony level charge? And if you want to play devil's advocate here, this crime, if she has basically confessed to it and there is a mandatory minimum sentence, she could be if the timing is right, she could be incarcerated during the next general election and not be eligible to vote in the general election. But her colleagues have to now make a decision. Do we want to force the issue and have her voting here in the legislature when she may not be eligible under our state law to vote in the next general election because of what she's done? So this is a complex dynamic within a caucus, and whether or not they want to, and you always have to worry about too, how much of this spills over onto other members. And that's why they've been so quiet, right? Because not all the facts are probably out in this case. There's probably more that we're going to learn. We've already learned more in the last 24 hours. So if they take a strong position and say, no, she has to be there to vote, and of course they're going to want her there to vote because they have some unfinished business, right, at the end of the second legislative session of the biennium. And I'm sure there's been some stuff sitting on the back burner waiting to pass at the very end. There always is. And if those things are controversial and they need her vote, they're going to push the envelope and try to convince the public that it's okay for her to stay there and vote in the legislature until this thing is resolved. And legally, it probably is, right? Morally and ethically, I don't think that it is. And I don't think that this passes 1 second of a smell test on moral and ethical issues for a lawmaker.
A brief and breaking news update. The Minnesota Senate has convened a floor session today. So they're going to meet, and they're meeting right now while we're recording this. Jeff.
They are meeting. That's interesting. They had, as of about 15 minutes ago, stated to the press that they were not meeting. So that's...
No, I think what they had said is they were going to meet, but they were not going to pass bills.
Okay.
So that's the distinction. And there was some information on social media that the entire week was going to be canceled. I don't think that's panned out to be accurate.
Apparently, and probably very smartly, they're going to take some time for all those dynamics I just talked about. They're going to take some time, it looks like, to make that decision whether we want to push the envelope and try to have her voting on legislation, or whether we will ask her to resign or just not show up until the end of session or something like that. So it does appear, and I think that's a smart decision on their part. You can't shut down the state because of it, but not bringing up bills and not trying to pass anything means she won't have to vote on anything. And they've got some time then to make that decision.
So I've got two things I wanted to cover here. One thing, you mentioned that in some instances, people came out the other side of these things better, or not better than you expected. And you attributed that to basically how they handled it, and I would assume some of their pre-existing relationships and with people. Does her statement yesterday does that make it harder for her to come out the other side of this?
I think it does. I think I'll read my tweet from yesterday when I read her statement. I said, this statement is a case study on how to make a bad situation worse. Yeah. This is in direct conflict with the already confessed, reported, and known facts of this case. This situation is only going to get worse for her until she takes full responsibility. That one, I think, had 21,000 views on that tweet. It does make it worse. She would have been better off to not, if she's an attorney, I can't believe she said anything to the police at the time. She should have just shut her mouth and not said a word. And then it maybe would have been okay to come out with this statement later and say, hey, there's some underlying dynamics here, and I was really worried about my stepmom's safety. Maybe you could have got away with that. But I think the facts of the case, the fact that it just makes it very difficult.
We have breaking news. The Minnesota Senate GOP caucus has filed an ethics complaint against DFL Senator Nicole Mitchell Woodbury in the wake of her arrest and charging in a burglary case early Monday morning. Mitchell is not on the Senate floor session. That's from Tom Hauser at T Hauser KSTP. An ethics complaint has been filed.
Interesting. Yeah. And I would have expected that today. I think, do we know who filed it? Does it say?
I don't know who filed it at this point. Jeff, you had more.
I wanted to say, so as your audience should be painfully aware at this point, I was also a minor elected official at one point and had my own share of scandal-related things going on at the municipal level. We had a situation with a police officer in Crystal who made a number of bad choices and absolutely 100% deserved to be fired. On his way out the door, he aligned himself with some activist groups and got them to buy into this false story that he was some kind of whistleblower and he was being railroaded, or he was being punished for whistleblowing and whatever. And none of this information was public at the time. I remember sitting on the outside. This was actually even before I was elected. Sitting on the outside, what was going on in that case crystal clear was a letter to the editor from the head of the police union in Crystal that basically said, I'll paraphrase, but it was basically like, yeah, we're not going to bat for this guy, which was sending a message between the lines saying everybody needs to wait for the facts to come out, because if the union's not going to go to bat for this guy, then everybody else should stand down. Um, and I tell that story because I was curious. This is the statement from Senate Majority Leader Aaron Murphy that went out yesterday. The allegations against Senator Mitchell are upsetting for me and for anyone who has gotten to know and work with her. The behavior alleged is far outside the character she has established in the Senate and in her distinguished career in the military. We believe in due process, and Senator Mitchell has the right to a full defense of her case in court. In the coming days and weeks, Senator Mitchell must also have serious and difficult conversations with her colleagues, constituents, and family. So we know what that statement said. We know the black and white words of what it said, but there was obviously some other messaging. There always is, right? In a statement like that, there's some other subtle messaging that's going on in there. What do you make of that particular statement? And is it harsher than you expected? Is it about what you expected? What do you think about that statement?
I think it's a pretty good statement. And let's jump in Aaron Murphy's brain at the moment. She probably doesn't have all the facts. She's being barraged with phone calls and media inquiries asking what's going to happen. And I've been in that situation in the past where it just, your whole world stops and this is the only thing going on and it's an emergency and you got to try to figure it out. But you have to navigate through it not really knowing all the facts. And if I remember right, that statement came out prior to Senator Mitchell even being released from jail and prior to her court. If you're in Aaron Murphy's mind, she needs to respond, right? She can't not say anything. She needs to allow for any possibility in the future. She needs to allow for the possibility in her words or in her statement that Senator Mitchell will be forgiven and will continue, and all of this is some misunderstanding or whatever. And she needs to also allow for the possibility that this is a very serious thing and there was a huge lapse of judgment and the public's not going to forgive her and she's going to be convicted of this crime and she'll have to resign from the Senate or be expelled from the Senate or whatever. And that's a very obviously Aaron Murphy wants and understand too, she's also in this dynamic where she's got a 1-seat majority, and this is the 1 seat, right, that she can't afford to lose with 3.5 weeks left of a legislative session where they have some unfinished business yet to pass. So she's got a legislative agenda. She wants to get that stuff done. And so I'm sure she's trying to figure out how can we fix this enough so the senator can vote and we can finish out our legislative session, and then she can, if it's bad enough, ride off into the sunset, or she can fight out her day in court and let the court decide whether she's innocent or guilty. And that's a tough thing to do in a statement, especially when you don't have all the facts. So I think it was a very well written statement.
Exactly. The code that actually, Michael, it was the code that you brought up to me yesterday, and then I took the idea and made it look like it was my own idea. I went out with it publicly, was that the wording around in the coming weeks and months was definitely designed to tamp down any expectations that there would be any immediate action on this, or any action at least before the end of the legislative session. And I think that was a great observation. So I'll give you credit for it here.
Thanks, Jeff. It's very nice of you.
I'll give you credit for your own idea there.
Should we do a public acknowledgement of all the great ideas that you've posted to mine? Don't have that much time for the show, but we can figure that out at a later point.
Yeah.
I want to ask you both, what is the calculus that's being made right now, do you think, in terms of what should be the punishment for her institutionally in relation to what she's been charged with? And also, what kind of calculation do you think is going on right now in terms of what can be done because of the math in the Senate, keeping her there? It's 67 members, but mathematically, removing her from the equation makes the Senate 33-33. It's a statistical tie. It's a dead heat. How do you think the seriousness of the crime will factor in to what type of legislative punishment she has this session? And will all of that be overlooked so she can vote and quickly get out, and so the Democrats can quickly get out and move past this?
I think they're going to do everything they can to keep her there voting. And they're going to talk about everybody's innocent until proven guilty, all of those things.
Is that realistic?
I don't think so. And my question for you is, when is the last time we've had a sitting member of the legislature charged with a felony where there's basically an admission or a confession upon the arrest and the I just don't even know. I can't think of another time that there's been a sitting member charged with a felony.
The only, and I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of this, but the only criminal complaints that I am aware of in the legislature in the past decade at least, and then
Yeah.
go back even a little bit further, are all generally alcohol related in some way and usually involving a vehicle.
Yeah.
This type of like burglary is a new one, right? We've had other types of scandals that were non-criminal that are whatever, but they all fit in a neat sort of what you're used to seeing. Burglary, and then again, as you mentioned, and then admitting the burglary is a new one, and you generally don't see this serious of a crime, I guess I would say. Not that the other crimes are not serious. I've got a whole soapbox I could get up on about vehicular crimes, but that's not for this day. But this is a fairly unique case as far as I can recall.
I'm going to say to both of you, I'm watching the floor session right now. I believe a roll call vote was just requested by Senator Lucero to expel Mitchell from the Senate. I apologize. And I apologize if I'm inaccurate in what I'm saying right now. I'm trying to record this podcast while keeping an eye on the breaking news. So I do believe, if I read the transcript correctly, Senator Lucero just stood up and, under motions and resolutions, offered a motion to expel the member. Senator Nick Friends, DFL of Mankato, I think he's the assistant majority leader, is speaking right now, talking about process and other types of things. That is, as Ron Burgundy would say, an escalation.
Yeah.
That escalated quickly.
Yeah, and the Republicans are going to, right, just so much as it's important that Democrats hold this vote and have this vote through the end of session, it's just as advantageous for the Republicans to make sure she can't vote, and also to keep this story alive and make sure that the public realizes the severity of the charges here and the details of the case. So this is obviously a step in that, a cog in that wheel to try to keep this story going and make sure that people understand. I don't necessarily think they're wrong. I don't think she can serve in the legislature. We talked about whether there's been a felony level charge of this sort of nature with a sitting legislator. I don't think there has been.
Michael, you had one from the 80s or something, didn't you? Or for like
Senator Fischbach was elected in a special election after the resignation of Senator Fischbach, now Congresswoman Fischbach, from the 7th Congressional District and former Lieutenant Governor. She was elected in a special election involving Senator Joe Bertram. But he had been charged and I think he pleaded guilty, and that's when the ethics process continued.
Was that a theft situation as well?
That was a theft situation, and yes, and I think I know, Mr. Speaker, members of the legislature love custom, they love tradition, they love to go through history books and examine stuff. I think it's fair to say, based on just all of our kind of political knowledge and experience, I think what's making this so difficult is, first of all, you have the criminal charge and you have the visuals, and what you can read and what you know was provided to a statement to the court under perjury of law, and what we know and what she said. And it's pretty black and white in terms of what she's charged with based on what she said. I think the curveball escalation and what gassed this, to take words from Jeff, is the statement yesterday.
Yeah.
And I think the statement is what's really gassed this situation. And there's a part of me that thinks that the hope was that statement, that was a political statement, not a legal statement. That was not done anything in terms of the legal process. It was meant from a political standpoint. And again, this is a citizen legislature. Legislators are allowed to have jobs and work outside the legislature. It's not considered full-time, which that means sometimes is they're out doing real life things and they're real human beings. And I think everyone can understand, and you've listed some experiences that you had with members in a variety of ways. But I do think what the challenge here is, it's the criminal charges, it's what her lawyer has been saying what she did, which is basically an admission, and then her public statement. It's a problem right now. And that's where I think this situation escalated very quickly.
And I think that the statement does create a problem for her. And your comment that this statement was a political statement, I agree with that. I think it was. But there's no way that statement doesn't become part of the court case and the evidence. And that doesn't get, if there's a trial on this, that statement is admissible. I think the only place that a political speech is not admissible in a courtroom is if you give it on the House or Senate floor. And we have a constitutional protection that says you cannot be questioned in any other place for a speech that you give during a House or Senate session.
Well, la-ti-da.
So this
Right.
is funny.
But
Sorry, go ahead.
that's a public statement. She made a public statement,
Yeah.
and that will be admissible in court. And she's going to have to try to justify the contradicting facts of the statement and what she said to the police when she was arrested.
In your guys' experience, based on what we know now, including what she was charged with, the statements from her lawyer, and her public statement, do both of you agree that she should resign immediately from the legislature?
I do.
I do. Yeah,
Yep.
I do.
Yeah,
I think I have a lower bar than to reach that, or a higher bar. Personally, my personal opinion is I'm a little bit more hardcore on the topic than I think maybe the general consensus, but so I absolutely do.
And partisanship isn't factoring into your answer. You're not saying that just because she's a Democrat.
No, but I do want to point out something that I saw an interesting exchange last night between Speaker Daudt and former, what was he? He was the majority leader, wasn't he? Ryan Winkler, right? So another guy who had some experience leading a caucus and living through these kind of things, and had a couple of high-profile scandals of his own that were not handled all that well, in my opinion. But that's neither here nor there. Two things can be true at the same time, and they often are. The fact that this is politically advantageous to Republicans can exist on the same plane as the fact that this is an untenable position for a legislator to be in. And whether every single person would get to the exact same place if the R's and the D's were flipped, I don't know. But personally, I can speak for myself in that absolutely, if this was any Republican senator, no, you can't be caught in the cat burglar suit and then come back and vote on the Senate floor the next day. That there has to be a line somewhere, right?
I will add some commentary to my answer to your question, Michael, which is, do I think she should resign? And just to demonstrate that I'm consistent, when I was Speaker of the House, I asked one of my own members to resign for less than this, and he did resign. And so leadership is not an easy thing. And I always think that the true test of a leader is, are you willing? It's the old kind of definition of integrity. Are you willing to do something, even if it hurts, if it's the right thing, even if it hurts you politically? And I think that's not only a great definition for integrity, it's also a good definition for someone who is a good leader.
I wanted to take this a slightly different angle, but it's still related. Speaker Daudt, it's no secret, you had some members in your own caucus who were not your biggest fan, right? So it's a majority vote situation to be elected. You're not always going to be everyone's first choice. Erin Murphy is in exactly the same spot. She had a very narrow election. She's leading over divided caucus. People were, at least a large portion of her caucus was not happy, or at a minimum skeptical of her ability to lead the caucus in the first place. How does that particular dynamic, do you believe, in a time of crisis, call it, right? Is it more likely the caucus rallies around the leader and supports where they're going, or is it more likely that the knives come out and people are going to try and make their play?
I think so. Let me go back and respond to part of your question where Erin Murphy was just elected. She ran the previous time as well. She was beat. It's my understanding that she has won with just 50% or just a little bit more than that it's been close elections every time. And when she lost, I think she only lost by one vote in the caucus. At least that's what I hear. These sort of caucus elections are always supposed to be secret. They usually never are. I will say that my caucus is the only one of the four, to my knowledge, that has a threshold higher than 50% to elect the leader. And our caucus has for years, since way before my time, had a rule similar to a party endorsement where you have to achieve a 60% vote of the caucus to get elected. So I never felt like yes, I always had detractors and I always had people who were against me. I never felt like there was a critical mass there or my leadership was in question. To get to the heart of your question, what happens in this situation? Do the knives come out? if I showed up with sunshine, ice cream cones, chocolate chip cookies, and puppies to a caucus meeting, the knives would have been out from those handful of people that they hated everything I did, even when I was, did the best thing in the world. They still hated it. So, what, to the heart of your question, this sort of a situation just opens up an opportunity for people to, with a put your leadership skills under a magnifying glass or a microscope and analyze every little detail of what you have done and whether you've done it correctly. And these can be a real test, right? Getting through these is not easy. And it's not anything that Erin Murphy asked for or wanted, but she's going to have to navigate this. And I think her first statement that she put out, of course, there's a lot going on behind closed doors that we don't know and we don't see. But the first statement that she put out publicly, I think, was 100% spot on. I think it was very good, was what she needed to do. I still don't think she's going to be able to keep Senator Mitchell in the Senate voting through the end of session. I think it's going to be too controversial. I don't think it's the right thing to do. And that puts the Senate into a tied situation. And I don't know if Erin Murphy won by one vote. Maybe there's a bigger dynamic going on here that maybe that one vote was one vote for Erin Murphy, or it was one vote against Erin Murphy. And Erin Murphy probably knows that, right? So now all of a sudden you've got that dynamic. Not just can we pass legislation, but is the leadership of the caucus in jeopardy? And that particular caucus has changed leaders 6 or 7 times in the last.
Well, and I think we have examples too where people did not handle things well internally, and that was ultimately their downfall within the caucus, where the former senator from Woodbury, actually, in some irony here, is no longer the leader of that caucus for some decisions that were made. She was the leader that didn't sit well with the caucus. So I think that these do have real world consequences.
Senator Lucero is now moves the Senate be compelled to take up the Senate ethics complaint immediately. He has just made a motion to force the Rules Committee to immediately consider the ethics complaint and then weigh expulsion of DFL Senator Nicole Mitchell. And that may be a second motion, or if that was part of the first, but the press has reported it. Press reported the way I did live on this podcast, but then they've also followed up. So it may be one motion or two motions, but that's currently what the Senate is debating right now. And I think that's interesting because, as I understand it, there's a 30-day window. And so if the Senate Republicans filed an ethics complaint today, it does not have to be heard. I think it could be heard in the last couple of days of the legislative session.
Yeah.
And that gets to the math problem that they have, which is that quote unquote due process allows her to vote and be the deciding vote for the next coming weeks. So the Senate is allowing for remote voting. Do you see a scenario by which, if she does stay and she does vote, is it more realistic to you that she votes in the chamber or in the floor of the Minnesota Senate, or does she take advantage of the remote option that the Senate currently has?
I think we have yet to see signs of what Democrats intend to do in the Senate. And that could be for a couple of reasons. Number one, it could be because they're waiting for the pressure to the heat to cool off here and for the pressure to release, and maybe they can roll her out next week voting. Or it could be that they don't know yet, and they're still trying to figure this out internally. How can we navigate this? And is there a way to preserve her as a member of the Senate where she's allowed to vote? Or is this going to be too much? And is this going to blow back on us if we try to do that? And is it going to hurt us in the election? And so all of those are probably being considered behind closed doors. And as people are watching this from home, wondering, those are things to watch for. What are the signs that the Senate Democrats are going to try to keep her? I think right now they're preserving their options, but I haven't seen any strong movements that they intend to have her voting. And my guess is that leads me to believe that they probably haven't made that decision themselves. And what the Republicans are doing here is they're trying to get Democrats on record with votes or pressing the issue. Of course, this is creating news stories and it's keeping this fire hot. And the Republicans' job right now is to keep this fire as hot as possible. As you both know, because you followed, Michael worked in the legislature some years ago, and Jeff, you followed it for years. This it could unfold in many different ways, and it'll be interesting to see how they all react to this. And there's going to be a lot of demand to try to keep her voting, I'm sure. But what both of you, because you've been involved in this, is that when you have the majority, there's an incredible amount of power. And when you're in the minority, you have almost no power. And so when you're in the minority, your options to try to do something like this are pretty limited. And that's also why this dynamic of the one seat majority, and she is the one seat with 3.5 weeks left in session, means that this is a very high stakes game on both sides.
So I just want to, I'm going to put this out there. Rep. Pat Garofalo yesterday said that the path forward should be that we only take up votes on things that have bipartisan agreement and that we let Senator Mitchell deal with her family situation. What are the chances of the Garofalo plan going into effect?
You mentioned my little back and forth with Representative Winkler, former majority leader, Democrat majority leader in the House last night. And I jumped in on his comments because he said this is a GOP power grab and something about they're doing this to get revenge for their leader, Trump, is what he was applying or implying. And I jumped in and said, well, that's not exactly true, because if Republicans won't gain any power if she is expelled, because the majority in the chamber won't flip. The chamber will just be tied. And as I think about what the public might think would be a really great byproduct of this whole thing, is that in the legislature, Democrats and Republicans would be forced to work with each other. Nobody would have a majority in the Senate.
Right.
So what Pat Garofalo is saying would happen. And I actually think the public, if you explained it to the public, they would say, we're not against that. What a great deal to have an even number of Republicans and Democrats in the chamber and having to work together to land the plane smoothly here at the end of session.
So I think that would be fantastic. I have ultimate faith in the legislature to disappoint me. So yeah. I think I find that very unlikely, but it is an option. I wanted to cover, Michael, to go back to your question about remote voting in particular. If Democrats try to allow Senator Mitchell to vote, but do not force her to come to the floor and let her sit at home or in a jail cell somewhere and vote, I think Republicans should use every single option in the arsenal to stop that from happening, because that is the worst of all situations, is to allow her to just hide out, not have to face the press, not have to answer questions, but still get to vote on legislation. That's the absolute worst case scenario, in my opinion. And that's where I think you open up all tools in the toolbox. If I don't think she should be allowed back on the floor to vote, but if she is, she needs to be on the floor and she needs to be in that environment and she needs to look everybody in the eye and she needs to be able to get hounded by the press and answer those questions and all of those things. She can't just log in from home and be like, and just push the green button. That's something that should be objected to in the highest degree, in my opinion.
So a couple of things on that dynamic. Number one, part of me was saying, boy, if they really intend to have her vote, they should just rip the Band-Aid off and have her there tomorrow, meaning today. She should just show up, face the press, just rip the Band-Aid off and get it over with. That was difficult to do. And the interesting thing is, by ripping the Band-Aid off, you made it a one-day story. Now you've got potentially multiple days, because the day she comes back to the legislature is another story, and you get more of these shenanigans. But interestingly enough, on your question about the Senate being allowed to vote remotely, they are. And it's my understanding that the Rules Committee in the Senate last week adopted or recommended a new policy on remote voting. They debated it and passed it out of the Rules Committee last week. It was supposed to come to the floor this week, which would have ended remote voting, except for, and I don't know all of the details, but it's my understanding, except for like a military service type situation or maybe a severe illness. I'm not sure if there was even exception for illness, but they were going to get rid of the ability for remote voting essentially this week. And then this happened, right? So now what do Democrats do? And could Mitchell be the deciding vote on this new policy of whether remote voting is allowed or not? And she conceivably could cast that vote remotely. It just
boy, that would be a mess,
right? I mean, and all that does is open up more opportunity for
right.
Republicans to criticize and say, "See, you're trying to pull the wool over the public's eyes here," and it just gives them more opportunity and to air their case.
If I can,
go ahead, Jeff.
I just want to ask my last question here. I'm because this is something that always comes up in these types of situations. Do Republicans risk overplaying their hand and snatching defeat from the jaws of victory?
I think that's a possibility in some cases. I don't think it's a possibility in this case. I think that the details, the facts of this case, the charge that she was charged with, the fact that it's a felony level charge, the pure just outrageousness of the facts and details of this case. I don't think the Republicans can overplay their hand on this one. I really don't. I think the danger in this is for the Democrats. I think they have to try to navigate this very carefully. That's not going to be an easy job because this is obviously a pretty big deal. And it's not just a big deal legally. It is this kind of outrageous case that is going to make for unbelievable TV news fodder, right? Where people are going to be like, are you kidding me? A senator crawled through that dressed like a burglar in all black and crawled through that window. It's so outrageous and so exaggerated. And those are the real facts of the case. The fact that she drove up there left her home in Woodbury at 1:00 in the morning, got up there and was arrested at 4:30 in the morning, crawling through this little window. And then the stuff that she said, and this is not going to go away for the Democrats. And as much as Republicans believe that the media is biased and that the media covers for Democrats, and I think there's real liberal bias in the media, I think it's a real thing. On this one, the thing that is more important than conservative or liberal bias in the media is selling. They are businesses. And I used to have a communications director that always would remind me that news outlets are not in the business of telling the truth. They're in the business of selling ad time. And this is one of those kind of fanciful stories that this thing will make national news if it hasn't already.
Oh, it has, yeah, and it has it well.
And it will continue to do that. And if you try to cover it up or hide it or lie about it or change the facts, it'll just bring it all up again. And it just won't go away because it's so outrageous.
I want to update you both before we leave here in a few minutes with the status of the debate as I'm watching it. It appears again that they're still debating this resolution, which would require the ethics committee to take this up immediately. It's breaking along these lines. The Republicans are talking about the closeness of the vote where we're at 34-33 and talking about there's some major bills coming through. There will be a cloud of doubt if this Senator Mitchell is allowed to vote on legislation in this way. And that process, the Democrats are right now talking about allowing there to be due process. They want the committee to get their 30 days. Senator Latz just articulated that, if I'm reading the transcript correctly as it's being written, that she wasn't acting in this capacity as a senator when she did this. There's no allegation that she was on official Senate duty. She didn't do this in her capacity as a senator.
She did have her Senate ID card in her backpack at the time, so I'm not sure that
which may have allowed her to vote from the basement had she needed to.
Wow.
She had a laptop too, right? She could have remote voted right there from in the dark with her flashlight and everything.
Now, interestingly, in the dynamics, could she actually vote on this question? Now, remember that a motion that's made like this, hey, I move that the Rules Committee immediately take this up and report back so that we can vote on an expulsion. That fails on an even vote, right? On a tied vote. So really, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but the way my brain thinks is you needed to word it the opposite way where I want to give the Rules Committee permission to take more time or something, and then that fails. Or whatever that is. The problem is this can only be really designed to create a news story, because if they do allow a vote and it goes down on party lines on a tied vote, it still fails. So
correct. And the bureaucratic and on the Republicans, I think they're making a good point, which is we have a member here, and what apparently the Rules Committee, in all the work that the Minnesota Senate has done, there's apparently not a process to deal with an ethics complaint that happens within the last 30 days of a legislative session. So in theory, not in this example, the last week of a legislative session, a member could be charged with first-degree murder, and they would still be allowed to vote because we have to allow them to have due process, and the ethics committee can't hear that complaint until they have to have that 30-day window. What's happening here is a bureaucratic kind of snafu which is the Democrats want to give Senator Mitchell due process and allow the ethics committee to investigate as they normally would do. The problem is that 30-day window is longer than the legislative session. And so if she is allowed to navigate and vote during the remaining weeks of the legislative session, she will be the deciding, in many instances, she may be the deciding vote. And the problem that creates is a scenario that I would like to close with is what happens if she votes, if there's 34, 33 votes the rest of the legislative session, and then the week after the session's over with, then she resigns.
What happens then?
That's a possibility that I think is going to happen here, is that
I think
they're going to try.
Yeah, I think the possibility that's the scenario that unfolds is that my guess is they're going to try to keep her voting or have her vote during the legislative session and keep going back to everybody is innocent until proven guilty, which I believe in that concept. However, I do believe that legislators have to be, because we are the ones who create the laws and make the laws and vote on the laws, we have to be held to a higher standard. And there's an ethical and moral conversation that needs to happen in the legislature to resolve this. I don't think the public is going to be okay with her voting through the rest of the legislative session. And I think it calls into question then anything that's passed. And I think that's a black eye for the Democrats, especially in my mind. What I think the Democrats need going into the next election cycle is an amendment, a constitutional amendment on abortion that they could put on the ballot, which would then keep the abortion issue that won them the last election, right? There's a lot of people that thought that I would, including myself and including Melissa Hortman, that thought that I would be the Speaker of the House right now if it weren't for Scott Jensen's comments on abortion, right? And that issue worked well for Democrats in the last election. And it's the one thing that could really help them in the next election if they can keep that alive. If they don't have her vote in the Senate, they cannot put that question on the ballot. And now all of a sudden, maybe they can't keep that issue alive, and maybe they can't win a majority in the House. So there's high stakes on what's going to happen between now and the end of session. And if they do super partisan things like that and super divisive things like that, and they use a vote of somebody who's been charged with a felony that comes with a mandatory minimum incarceration, and they have that person voting on the House floor for purely political reasons, and they don't deal with the moral and ethical problems involved in this question, I think it is a huge black eye for Democrats. And it could swing the election all on its own, just doing that. So I think you asked if Republicans can overreach and overplay their hand. They absolutely, I don't think they can on this one, but Democrats absolutely can overplay their hand. And I sure hope they don't, but they may well.
My last statement will be this, and then I'll leave it to you gentlemen to close. If I'm looking at the calendar correctly, the following scenario could happen. An ethics complaint filed today. They could give now 30 days or 29 days. She could also cast votes and resign before the ethics committee meets, and it would still be within the procedures and windows. So there is an opportunity here for Senator Mitchell to vote, be the 34th vote, the remaining time of the legislative session, have there not be one legislative ethics committee hearing on her, and it still fits within the timeline. So she could get out of this and still vote, then resign, and not face any punishment by the ethics committee.
I think that's true. I think the ethics committee in the Senate has a little more of a record of doing things than the ethics committee in the House. But I'm not as familiar. I assume the ethics committee in the Senate is equally divided as it is I know it is in the House, because when I was Speaker, I appointed those members. I don't think there's a scenario where the ethics committee actually does any sort of punishment, or actually really in any meaningful way hears this. If the ethics committee is moving in that direction, or if there's a groundswell of public push for them to move in that direction, she will feel that pressure and she will resign before that happens. I think there's a likely scenario where they have her vote, or try to have her vote, or maybe she doesn't vote, or maybe only votes a little bit between now and the end of session. She gets into remember that her seat is not up for election until 2026. The Senate seats are not up for election this cycle unless there's a special election or an opening like this. And she gets into a court, the court case on this, pleads it down to a lesser charge, gets a slap on the hand, and does an apology to the public, and she does not resign, and the ethics committee does not have the votes or does not overturn or feel enough pressure to throw her out, and she actually continues to serve and finishes out her term. I think that's a likely scenario too.
I just want to bring to everyone's attention that the Lucera motion is currently being voted on. I'll give you guys one guess as to what the vote total is right now.
My guess is it's going to be 33-33.
Jeff?
I don't know that everybody's there today. Is everybody else there? It's going to tie.
Jeff,
It's an easy answer.
Jeff, if you were in the Senate, would you have missed today?
Well, no. If I was in the Senate, well, a lot of things went wrong if I was in the Senate. Yeah. So 33-33.
Yes, on a vote of 33-33, the motion does not prevail. So,
Yep.
Mr. Speaker, as you pointed out, a tie,
I've
it doesn't pass. And
been
so
doing this for a while, Michael.
Yeah.
And so let's welcome everyone to get used to the 33-33 number because we're going to be hearing that a lot. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for doing this. Mr. Speaker, it was so good to be available and accessible and come on today. I want to be respectful of your time. I hope you consider coming back and again, and we'll make sure our listeners follow you on social media on X at Daudt.
Thank you both for having me on, and it was really great to catch up with you both. And
Thanks. Yeah, it was a great conversation.
And Jeff, you're available at JP Kolb. Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. Jeff, you and I just spoke with former House Speaker Kurt Daudt. In a disappointing development, the moment we stopped recording, Speaker Daudt said some very nice things about us, which I can't say on air, but he said some nice things. And my reaction was to say, why didn't you say that when we were recording? But
that was actually really funny.
He is. Let me just say, I've known Speaker Daudt long before he was Speaker, and I was sad to see him going. There's a number of legislators on the Republican side who are stepping away, and Speaker Daudt is absolutely one of the good ones. I've always enjoyed his company. He's been so kind. He's a good, thoughtful Republican, and I really hope that he, along with Representative Pat Garofalo, Representative Anu Brindley, legislators who have left this year, this isn't the last that we've heard of them, and I hope there's an opportunity for them to serve in other capacities because I think they're great for the Republican team.
Yeah, I agree. That was a great conversation. It was talk about somebody who knows the dynamics of what's going on and has lived it. It was a good conversation with him.
Yes, and a couple points I'd say. I think his perspective is very fair and balanced. I think he's offering good institutional perspective, but also the fact that he's called for members to resign of his own party when he was in a leadership position, I thought was really insightful commentary. Because one thing I will point out, and I'd like to ask you this question, the level of partisan that Republicans get accused of participating versus what the Democrats do on a regular basis is night and day. And so I think that the activity today of the Senate Republicans in terms of what they've done on the floor, what they've released via press statements, has been completely and utterly proportional. I was very interested in your question about Republicans overplaying their hand, because listening to Speaker Doudt's answer, he said it's based on the fact that it's going to be difficult for Republicans to overplay their hand. But he did say that Democrats might could overplay theirs. And so I think that's the situation that we're in right now. As I'm answering this question, or I'm offering this commentary, I am listening I'm observing the floor of the Senate, and they're still having some discussions. Senator Aaron Murphy, the majority leader, is addressing some of Minority Leader Senator Mark Johnson's comments about how the Senate's going to proceed and other things like that. And so this is going to be an evolving story.
Yes, and it'll be into Speaker Doudt's comments earlier. The Democrats have a vested interest in making this story go away, and Republicans have a vested interest in making this continue to be a story. This is not a story that the general public, a lot of times this inside baseball stuff, nobody really cares about. But the facts of this case are so salacious, and Senator Mitchell's pushback so ridiculous, and her attorney's statements like so over the top ridiculous, and not acquitting her in any way, not helping her case, I think means that the calculus here is a little bit different, because Republicans want this to continue to be a story and Democrats want to make it go away. The quickest way to make it go away is to make her resign, but that goes in conflict against their other interest, which is to have her present to vote on some of these bills. So they are in a tough spot right now where they want to make this story go away, but at the same time, they need her to pass these bills. It'll be an interesting couple of days to see how this plays out, and a couple of weeks actually, because this will continue to be a story. But I do think that Republicans in Minnesota have a long history of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And I agree with Daudt on this particular matter, that they I don't know that you can overplay your hand. This needs to be a problem. And again, just because it's politically advantageous doesn't make it also not the right thing to do. Those two things they can exist simultaneously, right? And so you have a situation here where the Republican side, which is no, you can't go break into somebody's house in the middle of the night and try and steal stuff, no matter how mad you are at them. That is the moral and that is the ethical position to have. So you're not on the Republicans should feel very comfortable on this particular topic. Sure, it's politically advantageous. Who cares? That's irrelevant to the fact that it's also the right thing to do. So again, two things can be true at the same time and often are true at the same time. And Democrats are the ones who have to be in the position of defending somebody who admitted to the police that they committed burglary and then went on Facebook and lied about it a few hours later after they got out of jail.
The issue, how this proceeds, is so I think the Senate Republicans threw a markdown today. I think that they came into the floor session today, with a very aggressive posture, but proportional, just. I think it was well within the bounds of what is reasonable. And it was interesting, again, to get a Speaker Daudt's perspective on, in response to your question about overplaying their hand. Here becomes the issue. The issue becomes, will they continue it? Because this issue isn't going away. And it's a statement that I made before. The pressure they have to continue this message has to be stronger than the message to stop it. And so the question will be is, who caves first? Because right now they're in a statistical dead heat. They're statistically tied, 33-33. But the question is, at what point do they bring Mitchell back? They do have the ability to bring the 34th vote in. And so the dynamic is going to be who's going to break first? Because again, the Senate Democrats could bring in 34 votes, ignore the noise, and just plow through. But then the job of the Republicans is to make it be clear that they're not going to go along with this. And technically speaking, with 34-33 votes, the Democrats have the majority. There's not a need for Republicans in anything except bonding, except some other legislation. And so there's some gamesmanship to be done. But the Senate Republicans have staked out a very strong claim today. And the only question I think that you and I will have, I think is a reasonable question to say is, can they keep this pace up? Because this is a message for today, but this is the start of a long battle that's going to be happening here over this issue. And if Republicans stick to their guns and focus on what's happening during this legislative session, again, just talking from a partisan perspective, they can advance their agenda. To your point about reading what Representative Garofalo said, that would be the great compromise in all this, is if Republicans could work together with Democrats in a bipartisan way to get through the legislative session and work on bills of common interest. That is one possible outcome. I just don't know if we're there yet.
Yes, and I think that will remain to be seen. It's going to be it'll be interesting to watch.
Yes, and I do want to compliment one thing. You were the first person on social media to break the possibility that the burglary occurred at a home that was tied to the family. And so that was a good scoop that you had. And people should continue to follow you at JP Kolb for your biting analysis, your fact-based retorts, and great food takes and rockstar citizen journalism.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, follow me at JP Kolb. Follow Michael at Brodkorb. Although, based on your follower numbers, everyone follows you already anyway.
We'll see. There's always room for improvement. Jeff, thank you so much for being so flexible today and stepping in and doing this. This is going to be a great episode. I'll get it released soon, and we'll talk soon, sir.
I love to have breaking news while we're on the air. I wish we could do a live show. I wish we could do this 5 days a week. Let's work toward that, huh?
Yeah, let's work toward that. Let's stay tuned. All right, bye. Good. We want to thank you for listening to this bonus episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return this week with a new episode. Thank you again for joining us.